All right, so today we are really diving into some Clausewitz,
Oh, yeah.
specifically chapters 15, 16, and 17 from Book 6 of On War.
Okay.
And it's all about mountain warfare. And since we know you listening are serving in the military,
Right.
this deep dive is designed to equip you with some Clausewitzian wisdom.
Yes. It's, I think Clausewitz on mountains is very interesting. It's a lot of people have assumptions about mountains and warfare, and Clausewitz kind of goes against a lot of those assumptions.
Yeah.
We're talking about a time when warfare was changing rapidly,
Right.
new technologies, tactics, all changing.
Yeah.
So how does this all translate to modern military ops? Well, we're going to unpack that.
Okay, so chapter 15 opens with this age-old idea.
Mm.
Mountains are like the ultimate defense.
Right.
They're impenetrable fortresses,
Yeah.
a handful of men holding back an army. It's very romantic imagery.
And that's a seductive idea. And Clausewitz even mentions this himself about this common saying about narrow passes, right?
Right.
The handful of men holding back the entire army.
Right.
It's easy to see why people would latch onto that.
Yeah. But then he throws us a curveball.
He does. He does.
He doesn't really buy into it. He doesn't buy into the hype. And he argues that this whole concept, mountains as fortresses,
Yeah.
it was already starting to crumble, even during his time.
Yeah.
And he uses the 30 Years' War as this kind of turning point.
Yeah. And this is key because armies were relying more on infantry,
Right.
less on those clunky old formations, and navigating this difficult terrain. It wasn't just a logistical nightmare. It became an opportunity.
Right.
And that's where things get interesting.
Because then you have this rise of fortifications in mountain passes.
Yes, yes.
So it's not just that they're relying on the natural terrain.
Right.
It's like, okay, let's make these smaller posts and really try to create this unassailable front.
Right. And it seemed, and on paper it sounds pretty solid.
Right.
But again, Clausewitz, he's a critical thinker. He's always poking holes in these ideas. And he says, look, people are mistaking difficult with impassable.
Oh.
Just because, a mountain path is really hard for a huge column of soldiers or heavy equipment doesn't mean a smaller, more agile force can't find a way through.
Right. Look, if you can't drive a tank through a forest,
Yeah,
it doesn't mean that, nobody can get through.
exactly. Exactly.
Literally like determined infantry.
Right. And that's the thing. And so as soon as those flanks, which you think are secure, right?
Right.
They're vulnerable. Suddenly your mountain stronghold is not so strong anymore.
Right. So he's already kind of challenging those assumptions right off the bat.
Yes. Yeah.
He's saying, don't just assume because there are mountains, you're going to automatically win on the defense.
And it goes even deeper than that because he questions then the idea of large-scale decisive battles in the mountains.
Really? Okay, so that seems counterintuitive.
It does. It does.
Especially if you are on the defensive side, you would think, okay, terrain's going to give me an advantage.
Right. And everybody thinks that. But Clausewitz says no. Actually, in these grand decisive battles, mountains favor the attacker.
Okay, now that is a head-scratcher.
Yeah.
So how does he explain that?
Well, he says a lot of different things, but one of the big things is mobility, or really the lack of it for the defender.
Oh,
In
yeah,
the mountains, your movement, it's restricted.
right.
It's harder to react. It's harder to reposition, to counterattack,
Right.
You're stuck playing catch-up.
So even if the attacker is slowed down, you're slowed down even more.
Exactly. Exactly. And it impacts everything. Imagine trying to maintain clear lines of sight,
Right.
communication.
Oh, yeah. Forget about it.
In that environment. It's a nightmare. So it's incredibly difficult then for a commander to understand what's going on, to control the battle, to react effectively.
It's like trying to conduct an orchestra in a wind tunnel.
Yes.
Way too much chaos.
Way too much going on.
And then, of course, there's the danger of getting cut off.
Oh, absolutely.
That's got to be like a commander's worst nightmare.
He uses the example of the Austrian forces in Switzerland,
Right.
who often found themselves in these really bad situations because they didn't think about their escape routes. Mountains can quickly become traps, right?
Right.
So he's really painting this picture of,
Right.
it's not looking good for the defender.
Okay, so this is all pretty sobering stuff for anyone who thought mountains were an automatic win. But he's not saying mountain warfare is a lost cause, is he?
No, not at all. He's not saying they're useless. He actually outlines some very specific scenarios where they can be quite advantageous.
Okay, so where does he see mountains fitting into a good defensive strategy?
Well, he really emphasizes that they can be incredibly effective, but for smaller scale engagements.
Okay.
So think like delaying actions, repelling raids, securing territory, but with limited forces. It's about using the terrain to your advantage, maybe to even the odds.
So more like a David and Goliath situation.
Here.
You're not going to go toe-to-toe. You're going to use those mountains to harass, delay, wear down.
Exactly. And he really highlights how mountains, they naturally lend themselves to this more mobile, reactive style of warfare, which is perfect for like smaller units, irregular forces.
Oh, yeah.
Ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, lightning raids. The mountains become this force multiplier.
It's like that old saying, he who defends everything defends nothing. So you're not going to try to hold every inch of the mountain range. You're going to pick your battles. You're going to be smart about it.
Exactly, exactly. And that actually brings us to another fascinating aspect of Chapter 17. Clausewitz spends a good chunk of time debunking common misconceptions about mountain warfare. These were things that people in his day, they just took for granted.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's dive into some of these misconceptions. What's the first one he tackles?
He really takes aim at this idea of basing your entire defense on just the natural features of the terrain, like treating mountains as these giant castle walls.
Right, so you find the narrow passes, find those valleys that are like natural choke points,
Right.
and you fortify the heck out of them.
Precisely. He even calls out some military theorists of his time who were obsessed with this idea, mountains as these perfectly laid out ramparts,
Right.
just waiting to be defended.
Right.
But as Clausewitz points out, mountains, they don't really care about our human ideas of,
Yeah, they don't care about geometry.
Exactly. Exactly. He talks about how they twist and turn in unexpected ways, ridges split off, you have peaks and valleys. Trying to impose this rigid geometric defense onto that kind of environment, it just doesn't work.
It's like those old war movies where you see these armies marching in perfect formations.
Yes.
It looks impressive on screen, but you get into any kind of real battle, especially in the mountains.
Oh, forget it.
It would fall apart immediately.
Immediately. And he really drives home the point that clinging to this mountains as walls approach, it ignores the reality of the terrain.
Right.
And it limits your options.
So if we're not defending those high ridges, like, what are we doing? Are we just hanging out?
Well, he offers this counterintuitive perspective.
Okay.
He suggests that defending the valleys themselves can be a more effective approach.
Really?
Yes.
I would think that would put you at a disadvantage. You're totally overlooked.
It seems counterintuitive, but he argues it's not always the case.
Okay.
He points out that those mountain paths and trails, they're difficult for large forces to navigate. They can actually work in your favor. The enemy, they might be able to send small units down,
Right.
but it's harder for them to bring their full force to bear.
So it's almost like those passes are like a natural filter.
Exactly.
They can only bring so much through at a time.
Exactly. And here's another wrinkle. He argues that at those altitudes, with all those terrain features, limited lines of sight, weapons ranges are negated to a degree. So the enemy's superior firepower may not be as decisive as they think.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, that makes sense. But even if you hold your own in the valleys, what about getting cut off? I mean, that seems even more of a risk, I would think.
Oh, absolutely. He acknowledges that the risk of encirclement is very real, especially in the valleys. And he stresses the importance of maintaining secure lines of communication and retreat. You got to be able to get out if things go bad.
So no hesitation.
No.
If you're going to defend a valley, you got to be able to move quickly.
Exactly. Exactly. And that actually gets to a broader point he makes about mountain warfare.
Yeah.
It demands a high degree of flexibility and adaptability.
Right.
You can't go in with these rigid plans, these formations. You have to be able to read the terrain, understand what your enemy's doing, and adapt.
So we've talked tactics.
Yeah.
We've busted some myths.
Right.
But Clausewitz doesn't stop there.
He does.
He takes this up to like the strategic level.
Yeah.
And he asks this, I think, really thought-provoking question.
Okay.
Does having mountains on your borders,
Yeah.
does it actually make your country more defensible?
Right.
Or could it backfire?
It's really interesting stuff. And this is really where I think you see his genius for nuance, he doesn't look at these things as black and white.
Right.
He looks at historical examples. So he talks about Spain with the Pyrenees,
Right.
Lombardy and the Alps,
Right.
even northern Germany, which is relatively flat.
Right.
And he argues that these natural barriers, they're not an automatic win.
See, that's so counterintuitive because you would think,
Right.
okay, mountains, that's going to deter any invader.
And he's not saying they're useless.
Yep.
He totally acknowledges the logistical headaches
Sure.
that mountains cause for an attacker.
Right.
But here's the thing. If an enemy is really determined
Right.
and they're well led,
Right.
they can overcome those obstacles. And once they're through, those mountains can work against the defender.
Because now they're your problem.
Exactly.
They're limiting your movement, your communication.
Yeah.
You could get trapped.
It's like they become this invisible enemy almost.
Yeah, like you think you have the home field advantage.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it's like, no, these mountains are fighting me now.
Exactly. And he uses this analogy to optics.
Okay.
And he says there's this focal point,
Right.
where mountains help the defender.
Okay.
But if you push past that focal point,
Right.
the advantage flips.
It's like that,
Yeah.
you know, in a movie where like the hero thinks they found the perfect hiding spot
Right.
and then they realize they've trapped themselves.
Exactly.
It's like that.
Exactly.
And that makes sense. I mean, we were saying earlier, you know,
Yeah.
if you have a small, agile force, maybe you can use the mountains to your advantage.
Right.
But a large traditional army,
Right.
you could see them getting bogged down very easily.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and he uses the example
She does.
of a Spanish army facing invasion.
Right.
And he says it would be smarter for them to fortify behind a natural barrier,
Right.
like the Ebro River,
Yeah.
rather than trying to hold every mountain pass in the Pyrenees.
Right. Because it's that idea of, again,
Picking your battles, knowing where to apply your force.
Right, so use the natural barrier to buy yourself some time.
right.
Wear down the enemy, but don't let the mountains dictate your entire strategy.
Don't be a slave to the terrain, I think is the point.
Right, exactly. You have to be smarter than that.
And it's just, it's amazing to me
Yeah.
how relevant Clausewitz still is.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, we're talking centuries later.
Right,
We have technology he couldn't even dream of.
right. Drones, satellites,
Right. The whole thing.
unmanned everything.
Yeah. And yet those core principles,
The core principles are the same.
they really hold up.
Absolutely, yeah. The specifics change.
Right.
But those fundamental truths about strategy,
Right.
the human element,
Right.
the importance of clear thinking under pressure,
Right.
those things, they don't change.
Yeah, they're timeless.
And that's why I think Clausewitz is always worth reading.
Absolutely.
He forces us to think beyond the obvious.
You question those assumptions, right?
It's like he's saying, don't just look at the mountain,
Yeah.
see the entire battlefield.
The strategic landscape.
Right. It's
Yeah.
how everything fits together.
And that's a valuable lesson for anyone, I think.
Absolutely. I mean,
In or out of uniform.
absolutely. And especially, for someone like you listening,
Right.
serving your country.
Right.
Clausewitz offers this incredible toolkit for how to approach these complex military challenges.
It's not just the what and the how.
Right.
It's the why.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about warfare. So
Absolutely.
after this deep dive with us, we're really curious. What resonates with you?
Yes.
Does Clausewitz's view of mountains hold up in today's world?
What do you think?
Hit us up on social media.
Let us know.
Let's keep this conversation going.
Absolutely, yeah.